everyone, and welcome. We're doing a deep dive today on something kind of tough, but really important, childhood wounds. We're going to really get into how these experiences, even the ones way back when we were kids, can still affect us today, like in ways we don't always see. And what's really cool, we'll talk about how understanding these wounds can help us heal and move on, break free.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? How much our
Right.
childhood shapes us.
Totally.
And we can't change the past, but when we see how it's affecting us, that's often like the first step to making things better.
For sure. Our guide for this deep dive is Patrick Morley and his book, From Broken Boy to Mended Man. And he doesn't sugarcoat it. He says a ton of guys, like maybe even 8 out of 10, had some kind of messed up stuff growing up.
8 out of 10.
Yeah, 8 out of 10.
Wow, that's a lot of us. But it just goes to show you're not alone if you're dealing with this.
Exactly.
Morley talks about these core needs that are super important for us to grow up healthy. He calls them, get this, love, structure, roots, and wings.
Okay. Love, structure, roots, and wings. I like it. So love, I think we kind of get that one, but how does Morley say it works? Like, what does he mean?
So he's saying it's more than just, your parents loving you. It's about feeling really seen and appreciated for who you are deep down, not just for the good grades or winning the big game,
Right.
It's those times when your parents are just proud of you because you're their kid. Like that feeling of, you're my child and I love you no matter what.
Yeah, it's that feeling of being worthy just because you are, not because of what you do.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. What about structure?
Structure is all about having boundaries and expectations. Like a map, It helps you understand where you fit in the world.
So it's not about having a rule for everything, but more like having those guidelines that make a kid feel safe and understand what people expect from them.
Exactly. And then there's roots.
Okay, roots, yeah.
That's like that feeling of belonging. Like knowing you've got a safe place to go back to no matter what happens in life.
It's like knowing no matter how much I mess up or how hard things get, I've always got this solid ground to come back to.
You got it.
Nice. And what about those wings? What's that about?
Wings are about being given the tools and the encouragement to go out and be your own person, to chase your dreams, find your purpose.
It's like those parents who say, you go for it. I believe in you.
Exactly. It can make all the difference. But here's where it gets really interesting. Morley then talks about what happens when those needs, those love, structure, roots, and wings, what happens when those aren't met. He talks about these different types of, he calls them negative parenting styles.
Negative parenting, okay.
But before we get into that, gotta say, this isn't about blaming parents, okay?
Right, of course not.
It's about seeing the patterns, understanding that sometimes parents do things without realizing because that's how they were raised themselves.
Yeah, they're doing the best they can with what they know, even if what they know isn't, the best.
Right. One of these styles that I thought was really interesting was what Morley calls the demanding parent. And these parents, they're all about their kids following the rules perfectly and always being successful,
Yeah.
more than they care about connecting with their kids emotionally.
Yeah, I can see how that would be really hard for a kid, especially a kid who's naturally more sensitive, more of an introvert. I'm just imagining this kid who's always afraid to be themselves or make a mistake because they'll get judged.
It can make a kid feel like they're not good enough just for being themselves.
Exactly.
And then imagine this kid grows up and gets into a relationship. They might not know how to talk about their feelings or let their partner see their vulnerable side because they were always taught to hide those things.
Man, that is rough. It's like those early experiences just stick with you, creating these patterns in your life without you even knowing it.
And that's exactly why understanding this stuff is so important, because once you're aware of it, you can start to change it.
Totally. So we've got demanding parents. What's another one of those negative parenting styles?
Well, there's this other one that can really mess with the kid's self-worth. He calls it the belittling parent.
Oh, belittling. Those are the parents who always criticize and put their kids down, often trying to pass it off as tough love or being realistic. Really?
And those messages, especially when you're young, they can stick with you, affecting your self-esteem, your relationships, everything.
Do you find that people who had those belittling parents often end up being really hard on themselves as adults?
Absolutely. All that criticism gets stuck inside and becomes their own inner voice,
Oh.
They carry those negative messages with them, even when they're adults and their parents aren't around anymore.
Yeah, it's like those messages get inside your head and become part of you.
It's deep, really deep. And often we don't even realize it's happening.
So then what do you do? If you grow up with that, how do you even start to change those thoughts?
Well, Morley says one of the most important parts of healing is actually dealing with those buried feelings, like facing the sadness we might not even know we're carrying around.
It's funny because he talks about this thing called emotional amnesia. Like, we push those painful memories down so far that we forget they're even there. We try to convince ourselves it wasn't that bad, but it's not like those emotions just vanish, right?
Nope, not a chance. They tend to come out in ways that can really mess us up, Like we sabotage ourselves or hurt the people we love without even meaning to.
They're like a ticking time bomb just waiting for something to set them off.
Right. And he tells this story, really powerful story, about his own experience with this emotional amnesia. See, his mom passed away, and at the time he didn't really feel anything, like no sadness or grief, nothing. It wasn't until years later, when he was in therapy, that he finally let himself feel all those buried emotions.
It really shows you how important therapy can be, having that safe space to actually deal with those painful memories. But what I find really powerful about Morley's story is that he's so real, so honest. He talks about his own struggles, which makes him so relatable.
Totally. He's not trying to act like he's got it all figured out. He's more like a guide, leading you on your own journey.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest things he talks about is the power of forgiveness.
Yeah, forgiveness. That's a big one, right? It's so easy to misunderstand what forgiveness really means. Like, we think it's about saying what that person did was okay, when really...
Exactly. Morley's got a different take on it. He says forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. It's about setting yourself free.
It's that letting go of the anger and resentment, even if that person never says sorry or even admits they did anything wrong.
You got it. He even tells this really moving story about hugging his father for the first time, even though for years his dad was never really affectionate. It's a really beautiful example of how forgiveness can open the door to healing and connection, even in tough relationships. Have you ever had to deal with forgiveness, like really wrestle with it?
Oh, absolutely. I think we all have those relationships where forgiveness feels impossible, but when you start to see it as something you do for yourself, it changes everything.
What do you mean?
Like, when you realize that holding on to anger only hurts you, it's like you're the one drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. Forgiveness is about letting go of that poison.
That's powerful.
It's tough, but so worth it.
Another thing Morley talks about is trying to see your parents' stories in a new light. Not making excuses for them, but trying to understand where they were coming from.
Right, because it's not about erasing the hurt, but it's like trying to have empathy. Even when it's hard, how do you actually do that? Like, what are some practical things someone can do to reframe their parents' story?
Well, Morley suggests asking yourself things like, what was my parents' childhood like? What kind of struggles did they have? It's about trying to see the bigger picture,
It's like looking at them as their younger selves, dealing with their own baggage.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, you can start to see that they were doing the best they could with what they had.
Which, let's be honest, can be incredibly hard to do, especially if you're still hurting from things they did. But this reframing thing, that seems so important for breaking those bad cycles. Like, if you can see your parents as humans who messed up but were trying their best, it doesn't excuse what they did, but it might help you understand, maybe even forgive. It's like, say, hurt people, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't excuse it, but you start to see how that pain gets passed down.
It's true. And when you realize that, it can really change things for you. It's like you can finally start taking control of your own healing, decide to break the cycle. But Morley, he's honest about the other side of this too. He talks about this danger of using our wounds as weapons.
Oh yeah, I remember that part. It makes you think, like, when does knowing about our past trauma turn into just an excuse for our own bad behavior?
Exactly. And he owns up to it too. He tells this story about how he used to take his anger out on his family, even though they weren't the ones who hurt him. It's like he had this aha moment where he realized he was letting his past control his present.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, though. It's one thing to know you're doing it, but actually changing those habits, that's tough.
For sure. It takes a lot of work, a lot of looking inward.
Yeah.
And that's why I think Morley talks about how important it is to find support, whether that's therapy or maybe a men's group, or even just talking to a good friend. You don't have to do this alone,
Having those people, those safe spaces, it makes all the difference.
He talks about confession too.
Like admitting what you're struggling with.
Yeah. Not for sympathy or to blame someone else, but just to be real.
Yeah.
To let people in and let them be there for you.
It's scary putting yourself out there like that, but it can also be such a relief. And what I really appreciate about Morley is he doesn't just leave us with all this stuff to deal with by ourselves. He wants us to use what we've been through to help other guys who are going through the same thing.
Right. It's that whole wounded healer thing.
Yeah, the wounded healer.
He's got this quote from Carl Jung, and I love this. He says, "The wounded healer is the archetype of the self and is at the bottom of all genuine healing procedures." Basically saying that our wounds, once they heal, they can make us more understanding and compassionate so we can connect with other people on a deeper level.
It's like when you meet someone and you know they get it, they've been through something similar. There's just this understanding there. It's powerful.
Absolutely. And Morley, he's encouraging us to be that for other men. Create safe spaces for them to open up. Maybe it's just grabbing coffee with a buddy who's hurting, or joining a men's group, or being a mentor. It's about taking what we've learned, the good and the bad, and using it to help others.
This deep dive has been, wow, a lot. So many tough things to think about, but man, there's so much hope too. We've talked about how childhood wounds affect us, how we can heal from them, even how we can avoid using those experiences to hurt others. But I think Morley's biggest message is that we're not stuck. We can break those cycles and create better lives for ourselves, for our families, for everyone.
Amen to that. We're not alone in this. And just because we've got these wounds, it doesn't mean we're broken. Knowing that healing is possible, that's what gives me hope.
Me too, man, me too. So, as we wrap this up, here's something to think about. What's one thing, even a small thing, you can do this week to take care of yourself, to start healing? Maybe it's reading Morley's book, or calling up a friend, or just being kind to yourself today. Whatever it is, just remember, you don't have to do this alone, and healing is possible. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.